The path of an artist is full of challenges, which has pushed me to reach out to other professionals about their experiences. Join us as we explore the journeys of fine artists who have turned their passion of creating art into a profession. From their highs to their hurdles, these are real insights, breakthroughs, and triumphs to inspire other creators to reach higher. Welcome to the Business of Art podcast. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Business of Art podcast today. We are so thrilled and excited to have with us today Dr. Michael Duchemin. And he has a really incredible history and experience within the Western art world and I would say the Western fine art world in general. Michael, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Mark. Really appreciate your invitation and looking forward to our conversation today.
Yeah. I'm going to jump in here and just kind of give you guys some of his experiences and education, and then we'll jump into his story and have him take over. So Michael has over 35 years of educational expertise and professional experience in the arts, humanities, and social sciences, with an incredible emphasis on the cultural and intellectual history of the American West. His various roles have included president, CEO, executive director, chief curator, historian, author. He's currently an art and museum advisor and appraiser specializing in Western American fine art. As far as education goes, he earned a Bachelor of Science in American Studies, English, History, and Social Science from the University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point, in 1982. He earned a Master of Arts in U.S. History from Arizona State University in 1992 and a PhD in U.S. History from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas in 2012. As far as work experience goes, he was the curator of history, the senior curator, and managing curator for the Autry Museum of the American West from 1993 to 2008. He was the executive director for the Chinese American Museum in Los Angeles, California from 2010 to 2013. And then he became the executive director for the C.M. Russell Museum in Great Falls, Montana from 2013 through 2016. And then took a role as president and CEO of the Briscoe Western Art Museum in San Antonio, Texas from 2017 to 2023. And he now, he's the principal owner and operator of Historic Precedent Productions based out of Los Angeles. He's done that since November of 2008. He is involved in art advisory and appraisals and based out of Phoenix, Arizona, Los Angeles, California as well, specializing, like I said, in Western American fine art. So, Michael, that's an incredible resume, and I'm so thrilled to have you here and to have just this massive experience and expertise in this field, which is dear to me in the Western art world. I would love to hear kind of your story, how it all started, why you went into the education you did, those choices. Please tell us all about it.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I've been in the field in the American West is my passion, and I've been working in and around the West for, as you said, about 40 years now. And I got into it really somewhat accidentally, I guess, even though the passion was always there with film and painting and literature and so forth. It was while I was, when I went to Arizona to attend Arizona State University in my master's program, I really got the opportunity there to train with a gentleman named Noel Stowe, who was training historians to work in non-academic settings. And so museums would be one of those settings. But I was really interested in a corporate route with a company like Wells Fargo, who uses their history and their advertising, or Coca-Cola, or there's a variety of companies out there that do that. And I've got a great story about how I got into the museum field, but it takes too long, so I'm not going to tell it. But long story short is that I started with a small private museum in Phoenix, the J.B. Bayless Old Country Store Museum, and parlayed that and the collection there into a major donation to the Arizona Historical Society. This was back in around 1990. And that collection then became the basis of their 20th Century West collection in a new museum in Tempe, Arizona, for the Arizona Historical Society. It's a 100,000 square foot regional history center. And that project, we got moved into the new building and we were all kind of getting going with it. And then, as happens frequently, and especially in any kind of government funded agencies, a recession hit in 1993. Everything ground to a halt. We were in the new building, but nothing was going to happen there for 2 or 3 years until the economy rebounded and the state got more tax revenue coming in. And I had a chance to leave there to go to the Autry Museum, which was a private museum, not government. And I, was opened up to a whole different world there of what you can do with the right level of philanthropy and without a lot of obstacles thrown in your way by the political processes. And so I went to the Autry in 1993, and I really specialized there. I was their curator of history in the beginning, and I really specialized in understanding the exhibition process and started a method for doing exhibitions at the Autry that ultimately, when I left there, we had 16 exhibition projects going on simultaneously on about a 5-year calendar with 3-4 shows opening every year, and building up a rotation. And that experience with exhibitions, I really had a knack for that, and really enjoyed it. And in the early years, before Gene Autry passed away, we were doing projects that were several $100,000, many of them $1 million projects when you figure in all the advertising and promotion and programming and so forth. And the museum never said no to a single idea I had for 6, 7, 8 years, and then Gene passed away, and then everything changed after that. It got a lot tighter because he had been funding everything. And without that level of funding, the museum had to change its status from a private foundation to a public foundation, which meant only a third of the revenue could come from one single source. And so they had to diversify their funding source. So that was a big change, but we were able to, negotiate that hurdle. And in those years, the 16 years I spent at the Autry, I was working kind of broadly with art, history, and popular culture, and kind of a mix of different shows. I produced, a dozen or more shows myself, and then I supervised or managed, a few dozen more than that in my time at the Autry. So I developed that expertise, and I think what's really different in my training is that I'm virtually have a master's in business administration along with history, and so I understand the business side of running a museum or doing an exhibition and sale or a variety of different things like that. And most curators and historians get into that side of the equation because, kind of like artists, because we don't care for business, and you want to use the other side of your brain. But I learned fairly early on that if you can do both, you really have a step up on all of your competition. And so I did that early and then used that training. I'm going to jump ahead. After several years at the Autry, I left there in 2008 and was doing some projects in Los Angeles. Basically, this was during the Great Recession, where there was a big economic downturn in 2008, 2009, 2010, the real estate market collapsed. And I had started a PhD program at University of Nevada, Las Vegas. I went there to work with a guy by the name of Hal Rothman, who has since passed away. And Hal he saw history as a contact sport, and he wasn't afraid of anything. And I was doing a lot of national park related projects back in those days with a show called Western Wonderlands, which featured 5 parks. And then I honed in and was doing a major project with Death Valley, which again, I won't go into all the details of that. But and then Hal got ALS, and in 6 months he was passed away. And my reason for going to Las Vegas kind of evaporated, and I was more or less on my own after that. And Tom Petrie from the Russell Museum came along, and they were looking for a new director in Great Falls. And I had the chance to go and work with Charlie Russell's collections. And my wife and I called it our Montana adventure, because I felt like in my career, and especially at that moment, this was 2013, the chance to really work with one of the masters of the Western American fine art genre was too good to pass up. And that proved to be the case. What might be apropos for your audience is that I've been working with contemporary Western art shows. I started with working for John Garrity when he came to the Autry Museum. I think it was in 1998. He had left the Prix de West at the National Cowboy Museum, and he came over to start a new show and sale at the Autry. And my job in those days was to make sure the show got hung. You know, I wasn't making any decisions about who was in the show or who wasn't. John Garrity is, well known in the field, and he was calling all those shots. But I did have to make sure that the installation got up and that it looked good. And so I kind of cut my teeth working with Garrity in those early years. And then eventually I became the managing curator at the Autry. And then I had to really negotiate with John about what was in the show and how we were going to run it. And, there was some real learning opportunities there, because in those years, Howard Turpinning was participating in the show, and he was selling paintings every year over $1 million for one painting. And in fact, one year the painting went over $2 million. And so when you have that level, there's very few. In fact, there are no other contemporary living artists who are at that level today, not even close. Turpinning is still alive. He's like 98 now, I think. But, this was 30 years ago, and he was really at the top of his game. And so we had all the galleries, all the big collectors, everybody was coming to the show to try to go home with one of those Turpinning paintings. And so it turned into a really big show, and has remained there until I learned this year. I don't know if you saw the announcement, but the Autry Master Show is no more. They've decided, they sent out an email in the last week or so saying that this year they're going to do a retrospective exhibition of the artists who've been in the show and been collected by the museum over the last 30 years. And they're going to do a miniature show that will be a sale show that will be run by Maxwell Alexander Galleries on behalf of the museum. So they're, that show, as one of the major museum shows each year, is basically ending, is what it sounds like to me. All I've done is read the email, and I'm sure a lot of your visitors will have or may have seen that same email. I'll send you a copy of it so that it doesn't look like you've seen it from your reaction. But I
haven't. I had not heard that.
So that, the only new work in the show is going to be miniatures, which means it's really not the same type of prestige show that it's been for the last 20 plus years. And how it's going to be run, I think it will be kind of in the model of what the Legacy Gallery did with the Scottsdale Museum of the West last March, where the museum loaned its name and its cachet, I guess, to the gallery to do a show, a benefit show for the museum, but the museum wasn't actually involved in producing the exhibition, the Western Horizons exhibition and sale at all. They just, received a fee for allowing their name to be used in the sponsorship. So it's really not a museum show in the way that museum shows have been in the past. It's a gallery kind of using a museum to help grow its show. And it feels to me, I haven't talked to anybody about it, but it feels to me like the Maxwell Alexander gallery will be doing this show for the Autry Museum, and it will no longer be a Autry Museum produced show, but
Wow.
That's to be determined, And there's a lot of tension between galleries and museums, especially in terms of these exhibitions and sales, and I argued, I think effectively a few years ago with Bo Alexander from Maxwell Alexander that, the museum show existed before Maxwell Alexander was a gallery. So, because there's a, very tense conversation about market and buyers and, museums basically honing in on the gallery turf, if you will. But the truth is that a lot of these museum shows existed before the galleries. And in the early years, Great Falls and the Russell's another example. The Autry's another example. The galleries were coming to the shows looking for buyers. And, that's always been the benefit of the museum show. And I've never understood why galleries got away from that, because that's where the new buyers are. And if you're looking for new collectors, you'll find them in the show. And for an artist, usually you get a better percentage with the galleries. So there's, a desire to make a little more money. But it's really the collectors. And so, I know my experience with Briscoe and Night of Artists is so many artists from that show got picked up by galleries because they were seen and their portfolio and their sales were seen by the galleries. And then, I can think of a dozen artists that did not have the gallery representation they have now until they were discovered, if you will, through the Night of Artists show. So anyway, I feel like I'm rambling now, so let me stop and see if there's any questions you want to ask from there.
Hey guys, I want to take a really quick second and tell you a little bit about the Business of Art course that we've been working on. The Business of Art is a comprehensive online course that teaches all about how to create art effectively. We've included some really great business tools like my painting price calculator, which allows you to quickly and intuitively price your work. It's the same calculator that I've been using for years, and it has saved me a ton of time. We have an entire section on how to create effective compositions using Photoshop. And we also go through my entire painting process, starting from prepping my panels all the way to varnishing and framing. Right now, we're currently offering the course at 60% off because there's a lot more content to come. So everyone who signs up will be getting full lifetime access to all the content we've already created, plus everything else that's going to be coming along with other benefits and discounts. We also have a full 30-day money-back guarantee. So if you don't find the value you're looking for, we'll give you a full refund. I really hope you'll go and check out the Business of Art. The link's down below. No, that's great information, and I think the question that's screaming at me right now is we look at these organizations like the Autry Museum, the Charlie Russell Museum, the Briscoe Western Art Museum. You think of the Cowboy Heritage Museum in Oklahoma. Right. How did these organizations play a role in the world of Western art, and how important would you say they are in kind of that realm?
Right. I think the first of these types of shows was actually in Great Falls with the C.M. Russell Museum, and in fact, the history goes back earlier than their history that they claim. They claim their roots to the Great Falls Ad Club in the 1970s, starting a show at the Rainbow Hotel downtown Great Falls. But when I was there and I went back and did the research, that show actually started in the 1920s, and it started as a fundraiser with artists to raise the money needed to buy Charlie Russell's original home and studio and to preserve them as a museum location. Will Rogers was the master of ceremonies. He was a buddy with Charlie Russell. So Will Rogers, and this is right after Charlie died too, was the other thing that was happening. He passed away. Nancy Russell was selling the home and studio. She moved to Los Angeles ultimately, and they wanted it preserved as a museum location. And so they started a fundraiser basically to buy the property and to buy the land with it. And there were shows held in 27, 28, and I think 29, and then it died because of the Great Depression. And then the Depression was followed by World War II, as we know. And then it wasn't revived until the 1970s. Norma Ashby and some of her friends in Great Falls really were part of that revival. And Norma had either no clue or wouldn't make a connection back to the 1920s. When I approached her with that research, she was like, what are you talking about? I started the show. There is no connection, but I think it really starts then. And my point in bringing that up is that a lot of these, and the same thing was with Briscoe, the Night of Artists as a show existed before the Briscoe Museum, and it was created as a benefit, a fundraiser to raise money to create the museum. And so the connection between, most museums don't sell art. It's the anathema to a museum. Museums collect art, but they don't sell it, and they're not buying, selling, and trading. They're not galleries. They don't operate like that. They buy and hold. That's their plan. But then in the Western world, you have these anomalies where you have museums once a year, generally, doing an art show and sale as a benefit. Now, the museums like the National Cowboy Museum are stretching that, because I think the National Cowboy Museum does 3 or 4 sale shows a year now. And I really do think that's more than a museum should do, in my opinion. But every museum, has to, as long as they maintain their nonprofit status, I think they have to do what they need to do to raise the money to survive. So I won't quibble about that. But that's how they really got started. And then you have a group of members of the museum and collectors from that region who come to these shows and support it because it is a fundraiser for the museum, and they get into Western art. As one of my collector mentors said a long time ago, they come in as decorators. They're looking for a painting to hang above the fireplace or some other niche in their house, and then a portion of them stay and they become serious collectors. And you can see, I've seen it with so many collectors. They come in and the new kitschy, like Matthew Hillier had some cowgirl Barbies riding horses through a Western desert, shooting up as one of his pieces. It actually was bought by a collector in Australia and it went there. But that kind of stuff is kind of kitschy. Some of the newer artists, Kim Wiggins, stylistically more contemporary. I could name a bunch of them. I'm spacing on names right now, but people will be gravitating toward that as younger collectors because it's new and different and something that doesn't look like all the other traditional art. And then if they stay and become more serious collectors, they always gravitate back toward the more traditional contemporary. I divide contemporary art into traditional contemporary, which is the Cowboy Artists of America and that particular, maintaining the tradition of Russell and Remington, and modern contemporary, which is more, I see it as riffing off the, what the Institute of American Indian Arts did in the 1960s to introduce new techniques of creating art to traditional Native American artists back in that period. And it feels like that Fritz Scholder, Alan Hauser, artists like that kind of led to a world where you could do Jim Vogel style work or Kim Wiggins or maybe even Mark Maggiore. Now, knowing that you're a wildlife artist, I'll just mention that Russell really, too, is responsible for wildlife and sporting art coming into the Western art world because he did over 4,000 paintings and drawings and illustrations in his career, which is a huge volume of work. And he kind of established, in a very shorthand way, cowboys, Indians, and wildlife as the 3 primary subject areas for what we now call Western art. And then sporting art kind of comes into that because a lot of the wildlife were actually hunting scenes of one kind or another.
Yeah.
So that brings that Philip Goodwin and other artists into the equation with that. And then, when I got into the Southwest with the Briscoe Museum, Russell made one or two trips to Mexico, but there's not a lot of Pueblo and Hispanic and Spanish work in Russell's repertoire, but there's enough of it to stake a claim, if you will. And so with Briscoe, I've added a fourth pillar, if you will, to the subject areas of Western art, and that would be Hispanic, Pueblo, New Mexico, and Texas, and some other areas where there's Spanish influence within the cultural heritage. So I believe it's Russell that establishes these four pillars of what we would call Western art now. And that's kind of how I frame my understanding of the field.
Yeah. To me, it seems like these museums have, with the Western art market and world, that it's been a very symbiotic relationship, where they work together and in their own way preserve each other. These museums, I haven't been to many of them, but I've been to the Charlie Russell Museum and I've been to the Briscoe, and I look at their permanent collections and even the museum in Cody, and these collections that they have are phenomenal. And we see the Russells, the Moran, we got Bierstadt, some of those big iconic names, and then Remington, and I don't know, the list goes on and on, with some of those incredible the history, the people that kind of established the beginnings of Western art, at least from my perspective. I know you know a lot more than I do.
It gets started
I'm
with
fascinated by
get started with Catlin and McKinney and Hall and some of the Indian portraits back in the 1830s. But there's a big leap forward into the late 1800s and the demise of Russell. His shtick was that he was painting the West that is past. It was very nostalgic, his work, and he was capturing scenes from a time that was gone. And Frederick Jackson Turner claimed the end of the frontier in 1890, and with the census of 1890, they said there's no longer a contiguous frontier line in American cultural history. We don't talk about the frontier anymore because even though there's a massive movement of millions of people who are moving from east to west along the Western expansion line, it is true that people came from Canada and Mexico and China and other places. So the convergence model has really replaced the Western expansion model because it's more inclusive. But I've done the research, and my community gallery exhibit at the Autry will demonstrate visually, the difference between what we would call a dominant culture in those days, a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture. Now there's a lot more people who are included in as white, like all Catholics, for example. Back in the day, Catholics weren't white because they weren't Protestant. And so that definition of whiteness has changed significantly, and it's become a lot more inclusive if you really want to get down to it. Hispanic culture is considered white today, even still in the census. There's two types of white, Hispanic and non-Hispanic. So that's a completely different subject area, which I won't get into any further. But my point being is that you could really see, this transformation as it was taking place. And so that line in the sand, really 1890, it's the end of the Indian War period, and the reservations are all fully established. And there's a cultural shift that takes place that you can kind of plant a stake there. And that's what Russell and Remington were trying to capture, as a West that was rapidly going away. The decline of the bison culture during that period. Bison were almost hunted to extinction. And there was a much greater move to make the Western states part of the nation as a whole. And the transcontinental railroads are completed around that same time. That plays a major role in all of that. So a lot of what we see as Western art today kind of stems from that 1890 circa date. And you have, stories about trappers and mountain men and all kinds of other stories that go back much earlier than that. But that's really a pivotal moment. And you can kind of begin the contemporary Western art collecting period begins about 1890 as well. I've gone back and researched every generation since then. We've had 5, 6, maybe 7 generations of collecting, because each generation thought, this gig is up. No one's going to collect Western art anymore. The new generation is not interested in what their parents were interested in. It's all going away. I remember a panel that we hosted at the Briscoe back in 2018 where Seth Hopkins got up and said, Western art is over, basically. And Billy Shank was on the same panel, challenged him, saying, well, I'm still making a pretty good living in a genre that's gone or about to be gone. And now I think everybody's changed their opinion since, in the 6 years since then. But every generation has thought, the gig is up. I'm going to have to go find something else to do. And every time it has, managed to survive. Now, this generation we're in now is very different because of this, right?
Yeah.
Mobile miniaturization of communications. It changes everything. And there's so many more distractions now. When media was controlled and it was either newspaper or magazine and then radio and maybe broadcast television, it was still a controlled medium, but now it's a free-for-all. So being able for artists today to be able to find their audience on social media, to be able to be, streaming somewhere, that's a new dimension that wasn't there for previous generations, that our generation and the generations that follow are having to contend with that. But I would argue that it's going to bring, look at Mark Maggiore. It's going to bring more people into Western art, right? Most of those people buying Maggiore prints are not art collectors. They're Maggiore fans. But, there's thousands of them, hundreds of thousands now. And a percentage of them, let's say 1%, 2%, 3%, are going to become collectors. And of the 1 or 2% that become collectors, they're going to become serious collectors. They're going to be speculating on Maggiore paintings for, starting at 150,000 and going up to, eventually up to 1 million. He's going to hit the 1 million mark at some point, probably in his next solo show. So he'll be the new Howard Turpinning at that point. Martin Greeley's gotten close, but I don't think Martin sold a painting over $1 million. And there's other artists, G. Harvey, he does, astounding for his paintings, I think, in the secondary market. So you have to be involved in social media if you're an artist today. I think that's important. And it's a world unto itself. So get some help. Otherwise, you're going to be totally consumed. But when I started this appraisal business, they said I should be spending as much time doing marketing as I do doing appraisals. Like, you got to be kidding me. I didn't get into this to be a marketer. I want to do the work. I don't want to promote myself doing the work. But, that's the reality of it. If it's a different world and it doesn't matter really almost if you're involved in any other, although people do ask me for business cards still, your website, that's what really matters.
Yeah, absolutely. As you're talking here, and as I'm thinking about, this new generation and the challenges that we're facing, I think a lot of artists out there have some pretty big goals. Any newbie artist or somebody who's emerging or aspiring, they want to be a part. They want to be a part of these museum shows. Because it's one of those resume items. Right. I know that's how I saw it when I was getting started, and I would say I'm still emerging. I'm not. I don't know. I haven't been in this very long.
Right.
but what advice would you have for, you know, aspiring and emerging artists who want to particularly get involved with some of these museum shows and things like that? Like, what advice would you have for them? What would you
Sure.
recommend?
So a couple things with that is one of the problems I think we have or we're facing right now is there's just too many museum shows, right? The pool has been diluted because now everybody's doing one. So you really have to tier them into different levels in order to really get to museum shows and I'm going to say wannabe museum shows. And I'm not picking on these institutions, but they're at different levels, and it's easy to see. That's why I'm going to mention it. But you have Prix de West. That is at the National Cowboy Museum in Oklahoma City. That is the premier museum show today. They'll do between $3 and $4 million in gross sales. I'm not sure what their net number is, but all of the big artists and the most prestigious work goes to that show. And then you have kind of an emerging show like the La Luz de Taos that just took place a month ago in Taos, related with the Cowes and Sharp National Historic Site. And, you know, they did a show with, I don't know, maybe 70 or so works, and it was probably gross sales were probably $250,000 there. So you have a range between 4 million and 200,000, and those shows aren't the same shows, right? It just so you have to kind of set a benchmark. So the benchmark I set is shows that gross $1 million and above, right? That's one level of show. And you've got Prix de West is number one. Briscoe right now is number two. The Autry used to be number one or number two, and it's really declined. The Idle Jorg in Indianapolis, the Rendezvous Royale at the Cody Museum, or the Buffalo Bill Museum in Cody. Those are all, or have been. Well, and then I would add to it the Cowboy Artists of America, which is not a museum show. It's sponsored by a rodeo. And the Coors Show in Denver, also sponsored by a rodeo, but they kind of run with the museum shows because the rodeo associations are nonprofit associations. So they're funded through, you know, various nonprofit versus for-profit galleries or auction houses as the difference. So shows that are $1 million and above are what I'd call the prestige shows and the museum shows, not the rodeo shows. And then you have, you know, probably a couple of dozen shows, Cowgirl Up at the Desert Caballeros Museum in Wickenburg. You know, there's a new show in Tehachapi, the Slowpoke exhibit and sale. You know, there's a bunch of them that are at, you know, under $1 million. And then you have another layer after that, which are the art fairs and the festivals, you know, and the Jackson Hole Art Festival or Art Fair, which are another level. And you have artists that are there representing themselves directly and also galleries that are, you know, representing a stable of artists. So if you're going to want to be in a museum show, you want to be in one of the premier museum shows, not just in any museum show. Any museum show is a good place to start. And how do you break in? Now, the challenge for the artists is that I've been involved with the Autry show, the Russell show, and the Briscoe show personally over the last 20 plus years. And first of all, to get into those shows, and this isn't a matter of opinion, right? You have to be a museum worthy artist. Your work has to be good enough to hang in a museum. That doesn't mean that all the artists are the same or the equivalent that are in the show. Some are younger and their price points are lower and their work is not as elaborate as others who are, you know, selling for six figures and up. So being museum worthy doesn't mean that all of it is at a high price point, right? Because valuation or price and quality don't always go hand in hand. You know, there's plenty of artists that get collected out there where other artists will scratch their head and, you know, what am I doing wrong? Because I can't sell a painting and this other artist is, you know, selling out at every show. And so, you know, what's up with that? And so so try to get into a prestigious show. To be able to get there, you're going to have to, they're vetted. All of those shows, there would be dozens of artists who applied that didn't get in every year. So there's some competition to be able to get into a show. And once you do get into a show, it has a prestige factor that you don't get from anything else, no matter what your gallery does for you, and however many alimony payments you can make with your gallery sales. That's a bad joke, but it's not the same prestige, right? Because galleries aren't forever. Museums, when they collect, are collecting in perpetuity, which means that piece will be in that collection presumably forever. I've heard some recent examples of some museums deaccessioning work that has upset some artists who thought their work would be there forever, and turns out it's not the case, but those are rare. I mean, that's a very small percentage. So that's the value. And for a gallery, that's also the value. If you're, first you want to get into a museum show, and then you want the museum to collect your work. It's when the museum collects your work and you're in that permanent collection, that's where you really have something to hang your hat on from your relationship with museums. Now, politics plays a role in all this. So who and getting, I would look at the list of board members for any museum that you're interested in and do what you can to get those board members to collect your work. Because if I'm on the board of the Cody Museum and I'm collecting Mark McKenna's work, then when I go to that meeting, I'm going to go, Mark McKenna, he's a wildlife artist, and we ought to really take a look at him, for the next show. So you have that kind of input. Most of the museums run on a committee and the committees are anonymous so that no one can petition them directly. You can have suspicions about who you think is on the committee, but no one ever tells you who makes that final decision. And those committees then, and oftentimes they have guest jurists that join them, curators and others who really kind of set what's involved or who's going to be in the show and who's not. The paradox comes in for the museum in that if it was just a museum show and not a sale, the choice of the artists and the number of artists and the limitations would be much greater, because when you make it a sale, then you've got to include artists that are, in a series of tiered levels, because not everybody can afford to buy a $20,000 or $50,000 painting. And if you're only going to have the best works in your museum show, it's going to be a very limited sale, and you better be able to attract those biggest buyers. So the other side of the museum equation for their strategy is that it's involved in cultivating collectors, right? And this person is not a big collector today, but he has the potential, or she has the potential, to be a major collector over 5 or 10 years. And if, as a museum director, if I'm advising them about what to collect today, my eye is toward them making a donation of their collection back to the museum in 20 or 30 years. So I want to help that collector build the best collection they can, and then encourage them to donate that collection to the museum after they've had a lifetime of enjoyment with it. All that takes a really long lead. We're talking 10, 20, 30, 40 years. Most people in life don't have the patience and are not trained professionally to think about a long lead. Everybody is a short-term timer, But if you're a historian and a curator, you're kind of predisposed to think about 20-year plans or 40-year plans, and really keep those ideas alive. So the museum's strategy is to cultivate art. It should be. I'm not saying every museum does this, but this is the strategy that is the most effective. You want to cultivate people and help them build collections, and make them have a great time at the show. They all want to meet the artists, have the proverbial beer with an artist and get to know them and hang out with them and say that, I bought this painting from Mark McKenna, and he told me this little secret about it, that he did this and when he painted it, and they have some special story that they can tell about the piece. The story is almost more important than the artwork. right? And this goes back to Western art in general. The narrative is really important. So if you're painting wildlife, you want to paint it in such a way as they're all standing at alert because they heard a hunter over the next ridge, and they're wondering if it's time to bolt or not.
Right.
Or something that gives action or threat or something like that to the scene. You had was it a fox or a wolf, a jumping wolf painting at the Night of Artists a couple of years ago that did really well in the live auction, as I recall. And it had that action kind of built into the portrait. So the cultivation piece is really important from the museum's perspective. And if people have fun buying art at a show, then maybe when it comes to the year end, they'll make a big donation, right, to help support an exhibit or some other project. And then those annual donations, the first step is to get them to become members. Second step is to get them to become donors. Third step is to get recognized in the will when the estate is settled at the end of, someone's lifetime. So, and on the artist side, if you're on that ride, then your work is being collected by institutions forever. That adds to your prestige, and the more museums you have work in, the more prestigious you're going to be as an artist.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And I appreciate this perspective. As an artist, it's easy to get really nearsighted and to see things from just our perspective. But hearing that and the different goals that you've had as a curator, or being directly involved in some of these art events and these, you have that long-term goal in mind. And for me, it's like, I just want to paint something that's going to sell so
Right.
I can feed my family this next month, and it's interesting to see that other side of the story.
I've advised a lot of artists about, who've asked, well, how do I get in the show? And you have to get your profile up to a certain level. You have to be seen. That's part of it. So do other shows. If you want to be in Prix de West and you can't get in, do other shows and be other places where the Prix de West deciders are going to see your work. And in that case, it's in Santa Fe, because all the collectors in Texas and Oklahoma buy their work in Santa Fe. So you want to be in a gallery in Santa Fe, a good gallery, hopefully, and be strategically placed. The other piece is the price point. In a show like Prix de West, their price point for average sales, might be $20,000. I did the research on it, but I don't remember what it is, but it's high. Right? And that means the average painting in that show is selling for $20,000. And if you're painting work that's selling for $8,000, you're not going to get in the show because your price point's too low. Right? So either raise your prices or paint bigger or do something more grand. Now, by comparison, the Briscoe show, their median price point averages between $8,000 and $10,000 a year. So again, you don't want to paint $5,000 paintings. You want to be probably 10 to 20 is the sweet spot at the Briscoe. But whatever show you're looking at, you kind of have to go back and look at, well, who's in the show and where are their price points? Where are they selling their work? Because if you come in the top 10%, right, you're the most expensive artist in the show, you better be good, because those are going to be the marquee artists for that show. But a show in Tehachapi, California versus Oklahoma City or New York or wherever else you might be showing is really a different thing. So every show has its own price point, and the smaller shows have lower price points. So get into those shows and then try to win awards. Paint something that's going to be especially noted, because along with your sales history, your awards history matters too. And, this, I've seen it especially with sculptors who get recognized by the National Sculptor Society or the Art and the Animal Society, or, there's lots of painting groups out there too. But those awards matter, right? To not only to the museums, but to your galleries. Winning an award means generally that your peers see you as an accomplished artist. And sometimes they're patron awards, or, popularity awards. And so that matters too. So you want to, and it's like everything, you got to start at a place where you can get in, right? Whatever show it is, and and go through any of the magazines. Western Art Collector does a good job of listing all of the upcoming shows and the timeline for those. And, and the shows have proliferated. This is the gallery complaint, that when there was only a handful of museum shows, it wasn't a problem, but now there's 40 museum shows. And every artist that sends work to the museum show is taking inventory away from what would otherwise go to a gallery, because that's the primary outlet. The museums become a primary outlet for work because it's new work. They all want new work. And so that, is direct competition with the galleries. Better percentage in the museum show for the artists generally. Better exposure to new collectors, generally. You're competing with 50 or 60 artists in the show, but you could be competing with 50 or 60 artists in the gallery too, depending on, how big the gallery might be. And getting featured is a key part in that. And one can lead to another. Like I said, I've seen lots of artists, not only artists who got picked up by major galleries out of Night of Artists, but then other shows that invite, the Autry and the Prix de West both were, spent, their place where they went to recruit artists was the Briscoe Museum, where they would invite 5 or 6 artists to be in their show for the next year. So there's a lot of that goes on. And I would go to other museum shows and, invite artists to come to San Antonio too. So that's all part of the game as well. But then the online piece of it and the direct sales market, what's called disintermediation. I had to look this up, but it's basically means cutting out the middleman and selling directly to your market via the internet or your website. That, it used to be you had kind of suppliers, producers, wholesalers, retailers, buyers. But now a lot of artists are selling direct, on Instagram to collectors. And first you have to do that or have someone who's going to do it for you. So it's not completely disconnected for most people. But you don't have to work through a gallery or a museum show or a fair. The internet really changes things, and people's willingness to buy art on the internet without having seen it just blows me away. You can't look at a picture or something and think that you can really tell, how well it's done. I mean, no matter how good the photograph might be, the context of the painting is different when you look at it hanging on a wall. And so I won't say I would never buy anything on the internet, because I have, but there's a limit to what I'll pay for a painting on the internet. Maybe under 5,000, I'll take a flyer on it, but you get above 5 and especially above 10 for me, I'm not going to do it. Now everybody's different. A billionaire might say, I won't buy anything on the internet under $1 million, so where you are in life has a lot to do with your tolerance for making a mistake. But that's really changing. It's changing everything. And I don't really, right now it's just a small percentage. People want the primary sales are in gallery and the auctions. The auctions this year, all the auctions are doing great. It's a seller's market for the first time in a long time in a number of these auctions, which means that pieces are selling above the range. You're getting higher than retail for your sales. Scottsdale Art Auction in April, 43% of the lots sold above the range. So that's a pretty good number for, and then you had another 30 or so that sold within the range, which is presumably retail, and a smaller number below. Now, for years, auctions were all selling, you were selling at a discount to be in the auction, and that can be really disappointing. So that's changed this year. The museum shows are not doing as well. They're all off by 20% or more. And I'm kind of, maybe there are too many museum shows. That could be part of the reason why they're not doing as well. Certainly the political economy out there right now, the events beyond our control, whether it's the presidential election or the war in Gaza or Ukraine or whatever else that people might be worried about, when there's
right,
when it's not a stable environment, people get nervous. For the big collectors, that really doesn't matter. But for the collectors we're talking about, in your price point and other artists that'll watch this podcast, it does matter because people are waiting to see what happens and they don't want to spend money that, even if it's disposable. And the really rich guys, they don't want to spend money because they don't want to look like they don't care about, they have the money and they're willing to spend it, but they're doing it in private sales that don't get recorded so that nobody, and private sales have gone up significantly this year too. So those markets are actually doing better, and all the auction houses will offer private sales on the side, and the galleries do the same thing. And the artists do the same thing too, directly.
Right. As far as resources go for, it sounds like you've done a lot of research. What resources are out there for artists to do the research and finding out, what sales are going for with different museum shows and things like that? What's out there for artists to use?
Yeah, there's no real aggregators, especially in the Western and wildlife art world. The market's just too small to really get noticed. I mean, the Western art, I valued the market, all of Western wildlife, sporting, all of that, at about $250 million annual market. And then I talked to some artists who convinced me that the private sales were much higher than I had estimated them at. And so I raised it up to, I think, $325 million. But that is in a $65 billion global art market. So it registers as, 1/4 of 1% of the world market. And in the US, the Western market is 1% of the national market for art, for contemporary art. So it's minuscule. And because it's minuscule, nobody does research on it, right? It's too small to warrant the work. And if it is being done, it's being done in the galleries or maybe in some of the museums directly. But it's hard to get access to the data. No one's really sharing it. So the way I've done my research is to actually go to the shows and count what sold, what didn't sell, how many of those bronzes sold. You can't get any good pricing on sculpture at all, because you don't know if one piece sold or 20 sold of that edition without actually seeing it. You have to kind of see it on the last day, right? Now you can monitor that through the websites by and large too, but you still can't get a good number on the bronze sales or anything that's being sold in addition. And so some of that you have to kind of extrapolate or call the artist. In my case, I'll call the artist and, hey, how many of those did you sell at the Briscoe? I'm curious, how did you do? And I know enough artists enough that they'll share the information with me. And then I track all the auctions. I try to track them all, but there's so many. I mean, Heritage has one coming up in 2 days that it's a small auction. And then now everybody opposite of their big live auction are doing online auctions. Like Scottsdale has a online auction coming up in August. They're all kind of mostly the B and C pieces that don't make it into the big auction go into these online auctions. But that's a whole another market. So it's really hard to track all of them. but I track all the big ones. Coeur d'Alene is coming up this weekend. That's going to be a major piece, and I'm predicting they're going to have a record year. Maybe not a record. I mean, their record is 35 million, and their average is around 20. So I don't think they'll have a record year because you have to have the work to, you have to have really great work. Sorry, I'm jumping around, but Scottsdale tried to sell a $5 to $6 million Russell in April that didn't sell. It was a no sale, and it tapped out at 3.8. So 3.8 is, and we don't even know if it got to 3.8 because the auctioneer is always trying to get the price up to the reserve, and we don't know if it had reached the reserve, it would have sold. So, and then there can be what you call phantom bids up to that reserve price. So you don't know if they're real bids or not, but the last highest bid on that piece was 3.8, and then there was nothing after that. And the range was 5 to 6 million. So, and the most expensive Russell that ever sold was 5.6 million. It was several years ago now. So they tested that high end or the top of the market, and the top of the market is soft. And that's true in the global art market too, that the pieces over $1 million are the ones that aren't selling. And when you miss on those sales, it brings down the whole market, right? Because the high end is 1% of the inventory and 20% of the value because of the paintings are more expensive. So most work sells, in the market as a whole, sells under $5,000. And then there's another kind of 5 to 50 is another, I think like 45% of the work is under 5, and then another 25% is in the 5 to 50 range. But the pieces that sell 50,000 and up, you're into the 10% or less of all the art that's sold. It's a much smaller market.
Okay.
It's a bigger price market, but a much smaller number of pieces selling. So one of the places that's broad that I go to, that's kind of my baseline, is a book that's published by Art Basel, and I think it's USB jointly. It's called Art Market. You can download it for free. There's every year is a new version. So the 2023 is the most recent one. Right now it's called Art Market 2023. And I read that cover to cover. There's not a lot about Western or wildlife art in it. It's about the global art market, but there is a lot about contemporary, post-war and contemporary. So you can see what's happening in the broader market and then kind of extrapolate down to your own experience. But one of my goals going forward is maybe to do a newsletter or to do some kind of research piece that makes sense of the Western art market. Too many of the magazines don't really have time for analysis. Here's the show that's coming up. Here's the show that just finished. They sold $2 million in the show that just finished, but they don't, and you get, nice in-depth stories on artists and their technique and their process and things like that. But you don't really get any market analysis, that from the magazines that I've seen. And so I see there's a need there to kind of fill that gap. It would mean getting galleries and artists and others to share information, not that they would be exposed individually, but that it could be aggregated so you could get a sense of it. And then, a big part of it, Mark, is connoisseurship, right? I've been around it for a long time. I've been following it for a long time. I know hundreds of people in the field, and I have a sense that comes from that about where things are going to go and which artist is going to pop and, which artist is not there yet or whatever it might be. A good tell coming up is going to be Kim Wiggins has a solo show with Legacy coming up in November. I think November 8th or 9th is the sale date. And I've been tracking Kim's work, and his $5,000 and $6,000 paintings from 2 or 3 years ago are selling for $10,000 or $12,000 now. So the market is anticipating to Kim to have a breakout. Now, if he has a $1 million or $2 million sale with that solo show, the way that Maggiore did, his $5,000 painting is going to be a $15,000 painting going forward, and he's probably not going to lose all that value going forward. There'll be a new bottom to where his pricing is. The Maggiore example, I can give you a little bit of detail there because I have actually analyzed that pretty closely. And before that solo show in March of 2023, in the secondary market, his work was selling on average for about $38,000. After the $3.3 million sale for the rest of 23 and into 24, his average secondary market sale went to $155,000. So it increased fourfold.
Wow.
Now, it's not going to stay there. It's going to drop off. But even after it drops off, it's still going to be, the bottom is going to be 3 times higher than it was before that big sale, because there's people speculating on his work now. And there's, he's gotten a lot of attention. So those big solo shows like that can, and same things happened with Martin Greeley. And I don't know what Kim Wiggins will do. He's a kind of a different, he doesn't feel like he's at that level, but what I can tell you that I've been following his work, and there's a bunch of them coming up at auction in the next week or so. And, his prices over the last year have increased anywhere from, a lot of them have doubled in anticipation. And if he has a good sale, and, Legacy's really good at making sure that the work sells, then he's going to have, come out of it on the other end at a new level. So those solo shows with named galleries are really important too. It's hard to get one of those. I get that, but they make a difference. That's how you make an artist's reputation. There's a lot of museum shows that are easier to get into. The Museum of the West show in Kerrville, that's a smaller sale. I think I've seen your work. In fact, you were on the cover, right, this last year?
Yeah.
And I don't know how did you do in that show? Did you?
3 out of 3 sold this year. So it went really well.
Yeah, and so you're covering a lot of those bases yourself. So you could probably answer that question about how to do it better than I could in terms of, what's worked for you. But, and maybe don't overexpose. That's the other thing too. You pick your markets and don't try to do all things to everyone. And every artist level, how prolific an artist is matters too. If you're doing 20 paintings a year or 50 paintings a year or 10 paintings a year, that's a factor too. And I know you're painting it, you got to paint at different sizes, right? You can't paint everything 50 by 50.
Right.
So, anyway, there's a lot to it. I'm just really kind of, I've been collecting work and, selecting artists to do museum shows and then promoting those artists in the show. And I've seen a lot of artists do well in the museum shows. But staying, the problem with the museum show too is that at a certain point, maybe everybody who wants a painting by that artist has one. And so a market that could be really good for 6, 7, 8, 10 years can suddenly dry up and pieces aren't selling, and so you always have to be looking for the new market too. And until you get to a certain point where in the wildlife world, if you're Bob Kuhn or something like that, you can put out he's passed now, but you could put out a painting whenever you wanted and it was going to sell at a premium price just because the demand was so high. But it takes a while to get to that level. And in the meantime, it's a volume game, right? If you're trying to put food on the table, then you want to sell as many paintings as you can. And so it's more of a volume and then I think as you mature in your career, your volume goes down and your quality goes up, and you're painting fewer pieces.
Yeah. That's interesting. I feel like I've got decades ahead of me in this world of mine, painting. But even so now, like when I was first starting, I was really prolific and really fast. And I've noticed this trend where I'm slowing down and focusing more on quality rather than quantity per se. I still need to push out a good amount of work,
Right.
but I feel like the quality is increasing and the quantity is going down, and that it just seems like a natural flow of how things are. But it would make sense even strategically, to kind of move in that direction as you move on in your career.
I think it does. I think it always helps to, I hate this term because it's so vague, but it always helps to be in that miniature market too, because your new collectors, the ones who can't afford, a $10,000 or $20,000 painting, they might buy a $3,500 or $5,000 painting, a smaller size, because they really like your work. And eventually those collectors are going to be, a percentage of them would be buying bigger work. So, and unless you're selling everything you're painting, it may help to be concentrate on bigger, more established work, and then feed the beast when it comes to the smaller pieces that you can crank out in a day, or not have to spend a lot of time with. But people, I'll tell you, as a museum director, I'm always watching at the quality of an artist's work. Not everything is the same. And so, I will look at what an artist sends to the Briscoe versus what they send to Prix de West or to the Autry or Idle Jorg or Great Falls or wherever. And I can tell if your painting you sent me is as good or better than the painting that you sent somewhere else. And yeah, some of it's opinion, but I can name a half a dozen artists that I know, I could prove easily they're always sent better work somewhere else than to the Briscoe. And then after a certain number of years of putting up with that, you're like, yeah, you're really not committed to this show. Because I look at what you sent over there, and, I can sell that painting, but you're not sending it to me. You're sending me your B and C pieces. And, honestly, I can't sell those. So maybe you ought to put your eggs in that basket. So there are those kinds of conversations that go on too, but every artist has to decide for themselves. It's a free market. So you have to decide where you're going to find the best dollar for your work. And if it's not my show, then so be it. And you want to hedge your bets probably too, to, be in as many shows as you can be in. But in a show that's worth its salt, people are paying attention to that. And as an artist, you should know that they're not just looking at what you send to that one venue. They're looking at what you send everywhere and comparing it, and then seeing how you do, the other side of it.
Yeah.
And the galleries are doing the same thing, and the auction houses, and everybody's doing the same thing with artists that can, or who are high enough up to register. And to be high enough up to be seen, that's just hard work and luck, and maybe a good marketing person or somebody who's helping you try to place your work. Or it's not really that hard. Museum people are pretty accessible. So call up the director of the museum and say, hey, I'd love to be in your show. I've been watching it for years. What's it going to take? And they'll give you a process, but you never know when you get somebody who's willing to be chatty or who knows your work and really likes it. And happy to have a conversation with you.
That's great advice. Yeah. I appreciate this perspective. I think that this is so valuable to this conversation, all around, the life of being a professional artist and understanding these ins and outs. And, I'm thinking, you've given a lot of really great points, and I feel like there's been some really awesome gems that people can grab out of this conversation. To kind of wrap it up, is there anything else that you think that's really important to this conversation that artists need to know, or you feel like would be really helpful to somebody like that?
There are a couple of things, I guess, for takeaways. One is know your market, and there are multiple markets, and think about where you are or where you want to be as far as sales for your work, and know that, like that example I gave earlier, Great Falls isn't very far from Jackson Hole, and you'd think the sales might be better in Jackson Hole, but for that particular artist, they're better in Great Falls. So as an artist, you really need to try to understand that, and then don't hesitate to explore new markets. Whether you do it through a museum show or through a fair. The fairs are very accessible as a means to get in, or through a gallery. Explore new markets and think about what you paint and where it's best placed. I would say that all the shows and all the galleries are regional. So you might be a Northern Rockies painter, you might be a Southern Rockies painter. You can tell the difference by the hues and the colors that you use in your palette, because the color palette is different based on the region. But know that too about your work. And if you're selling your work in Montana and you're going to try Texas, you may want to consider changing your palette, right, to fit with the Texas colors, because the Northern Rockies are purples and blues and kind of the colors of granite, and the Southern Rockies are ochres and reds and sandstone, and and the dust in the air is different. So the background, everything looks different about whatever that scene might be. So know your market. If you're painting for Texas, this is a joke from one of the people on our art selection committee. It was a hunting scene and with birds and dogs and so forth, and the painting didn't sell. And afterwards, the guy was talking to the artist, and he goes, "Next time, just paint some prickly pears down along the bottom front of that painting, because in Texas, the landscape is defined by prickly pear cactus." And I watched after that artist always put prickly pears in his paintings after that. So there's little tips like that, that might make a difference. But knowing your market, explore the online world. This online world isn't going away, and it's going to take up a bigger and bigger percentage of the sales as things go forward. So you want some kind of presence. Yeah. The easiest way to do it is through your own website. Put up work for sale on your own website. And unless you have some gallery arrangement where they won't allow you to do that, gallery representation, the artists who have it swear by it, because the galleries do a lot for them, but other artists can't stick with the gallery because they can't get that traction. So that really matters. If you want gallery representation, then pick the gallery you want, or the one you desire to be in, and then just keep working until you get in there. But those are some of the tips. Know your market and be online. Those are two of the big ones. And if you don't know or have trouble answering those questions, that's maybe where someone like me can help you define that a little bit better for yourself.
If an artist was interested in reaching out to you, I know you probably can't take every call that would probably come your way, but are you open to something like that, Michael?
Yeah, sure. I'm just really getting started in a new business, and I'm happy to have a conversation with anybody about what might be helpful. But I can only really provide a limited amount of response unless somebody really wants to be serious about it. But I talk to artists every day, who I've known for a long time, and so yeah, I'm happy to do that. I don't really have any of my marketing stuff set up yet, but I can share that with you, or you can share my email and my phone number is fine if you post that somewhere. Yeah, I'm always open, and I'll be more refined and more professional in my approach. Now that I have an actual location to work out of, I can start to promote that. I'm working on my website and the rest of those materials, but honestly, the work came so fast for me, I didn't have time to set up any of that stuff. So I'm really still playing catch up. I'll finish my first year in September, and by October 1st, as I start my second year, I'll be up and running with all that communication stuff.
Yeah. Well, that's exciting for you, and I wish you the very best in your new endeavors, and I'll make sure to have the contact information that you want in the show notes,
Okay.
whether it's below the video or below the information on any of the platforms that people might be tuning in on. We'll have that available. So, Michael, thank you so much again for your time, your vast expertise here. It has been so informative and helpful, and I think that this is, like I said, extremely valuable for artists to have at least this perspective, this other side of the art world that's a kind of it's a part of the landscape that we all need to navigate. And anyway, I think that's going to be it for the podcast today. And again, thanks, Michael, and everybody. Have a wonderful day and happy painting. Thank you so much for listening to the Business of Art podcast. If you're interested in resources and education to help you successfully create art and then sell it, please check out the Business of Art course in the link below. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you in the next episode.